Okay, good afternoon. My name is Philip Munoz. I'm a professor in the political science department, and I direct the Tocqueville program and our constitutional studies program. Pleasure for me to introduce Noelle Johnson, who's a senior. I just asked her if she was a sophomore. The time goes too fast here. Noelle's a senior. She's a Soren Fellow. She's also a Tocqueville Fellow, a physics and theology major, and she will introduce our speaker. Noelle?
George Weigel is Distinguished Senior Fellow and William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. A renowned Catholic author, his essays and columns appear regularly in journals and newspapers across the country, including First Things, National Review, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post. Perhaps most famous for his biography of Pope St. John Paul II, the New York Times bestseller Witness to Hope, and its sequel, The End and the Beginning, Mr. Weigel last joined the De Nicola Center on campus in 2017 for the release of his memoir on the experiences that led to this biography, Lessons in Hope, My Unexpected Life with St. John Paul II. It was during this visit, when I was a sophomore, Professor Munoz, that I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Weigel, author also of one of the most influential books in my own life, Letters to a Young Catholic, and so could not be more honored to introduce him to you all today. A graduate of St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore and the recipient of an MA from the University of St. Michael's College, Toronto, Mr. Weigel is also the recipient of 19 honorary doctorates in the areas of divinity, philosophy, law, and social science. He is a frequent television and radio guest, a senior Vatican analyst for NBC News, and the author of a weekly column, The Catholic Difference, which is syndicated to 85 newspapers and magazines in 7 countries. We are thrilled to have Mr. Weigel with us today to speak on the most recent of his over 20 books, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, How the Church Rediscovered Itself and Challenged the Modern World to Reform. Please join me in welcoming George Weigel.
Thank you very much, Noelle, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me begin by thanking the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, of which I'm privileged to be some sort of fellow. I can't remember exactly what the title is. It's a great initiative being taken to even greater heights from the foundation laid by David Solomon, by Carter Snead, and I wish Carter a rapid recovery. He's obviously not drinking enough bourbon these days to ward off the germs of Milwaukee, where he got sick recently. Before we get going, I want to acknowledge 2 other people who are here. Professor Vladimir Turkanovsky, sitting in the back over here, is from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and an old friend of mine. The Ukrainian Catholic University is the most astonishing success story in Catholic higher education of the past 50 years. Beginning from absolutely nothing 25 years ago, this has become the premier university in Ukraine under extremely difficult circumstances. And Professor Turkanovsky is here for the semester with his wife and some of his younger children. And I hope many of you get a chance to meet him and to talk with him about what has been built in Lviv, because there's a lot of learning about what Catholic higher education is that can go on back and forth between South Bend and the west of Ukraine. And the other person, where is Maggie Garnett? Maggie, where are you? There you are. This is Maggie Garnett's birthday. So I think we should sing Happy Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Maggie. Happy birthday to you. Right. Okay. I will never be allowed in the Garnett home again. Considering the amount of wine I drank there the last time, that's probably a relief to Rick and Nicole. The book I'm presenting here today is frankly revisionist. It's a proposal for a new historiography, a new frame for thinking about modern Catholic history, which is to say the history of the Church from the French Revolution to today. There really are no new facts in this book. I think there are some good stories, which I hope readers will enjoy, but what I have done here is rearrange the facts to yield what I hope is a deeper insight into the Catholic past and present. Those of you who have been to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, St. Mary Major, know that above the pillars in the central part of the nave are a series of what are called emblemata. They're framed mosaic depictions of biblical scenes. This book is a kind of emblema. I take stones that have been fashioned by some very distinguished historians, and I rearrange them in a new frame, which I hope provides a deeper insight into the past and present. So what's the rearrangement, and what is the irony of the book's title? There are, in fact, many ironies in the fire of Catholicism's encounter with modern social, cultural, political, and economic life. And they are scattered throughout the book. There's probably one irony every 5 to 10 pages. But the first mega irony, or perhaps meta irony, is this: that a relationship, Catholicism and modernity, that began with the hurling of anathemas in both directions. Voltaire hollering, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamy, meaning the Catholic Church. Gregory XVI and Pius IX in the mid-19th century hurling anathemas at modernity and all its works and pomps. That relationship, which began not too well, through the ironic, or if you will, providential workings of history, led the Catholic Church to a reappropriation and a deepening of the essential truth of its identity as an evangelical missionary enterprise. That is not how the Catholic Church thought about itself in 1789, as the Counter-Reformation Church begins to come to an end under the pressures of modernity. The Church thought of itself as an institution to be maintained. When John Paul II announces the new evangelization throughout the second half of his pontificate, that proclamation is an expression of a renewed self-understanding of the Church that is accelerated by the Second Vatican Council, but in fact begins much earlier. So the first meta-irony is this really contentious relationship between the Church and the modern world ends up with the Church rediscovering the fundamental truth about itself, that it exists to fulfill the Great Commission of Matthew 28:19, go and make disciples of all nations. And mega irony, or meta irony number 2, is that in the course of that rediscovery, over this roiled relationship of some 250 years, in the course of that rediscovery, the Catholic Church develops a social doctrine, a way of thinking about modern political, economic, social, and cultural life that today just might help rescue the postmodern world from its own increasing incoherence and fragmentation with which we are all painfully familiar. The drama of Catholicism and modernity unfolds in 5 acts. And that's, in fact, what I wanted the subtitle of the book to be. The Irony of Modern Catholic History, a drama in 5 acts. Publishers like these huge descriptive subtitles, so sometimes you win some and sometimes you lose some. Anyway, 5 acts, and between each of the acts, which structure the book, is an entr'acte, a piece of connecting tissue that helps set the stage for the act to follow, largely involving exploratory Catholic minds who are probing the boundaries of the next phase of the relationship between Catholicism and the modern world. But rather than going through each of those 5 acts and touching lightly on the interstitial bits, let me point out several pivotal points in this drama before suggesting how the rereading of modern Catholic history that I undertake here is also a useful exercise in myth busting. First pivotal point comes in 1870. In 1870, the withdrawal of French troops from Rome because of the Franco-Prussian War leads to the absorption of Rome, the last bit of the old papal states, into the Kingdom of Italy. And Pius IX retires behind the Leonine Wall and calls himself the prisoner of the Vatican. At that point, a lot of the bien-pensant folks of Europe, a lot of the cultured high thinkers of the time, pronounced the Catholic Church and the papacy dead as a force in world history. And yet, through that pivot comes something quite different. The loss of the papal states, the fact that the Pope is no longer a temporal sovereign, opens the door to a new kind of Catholic encounter with modern political, cultural, social, and economic life, and particularly with modern political life. That's an essential pivot in this story, and it's a deep irony. What seemed at the time catastrophe turns out to open the door to a quite different future. The second pivotal point comes 8 years later with the election of Pope Leo XIII in 1878. Pius IX, as many of you know, had the longest pontificate in reliably recorded history. He was elected in 1846, he died in 1878, do the math, 32 years. Conclave of 1878 meets, and the one thing on everybody's mind is, we're not doing that again. Okay, so let's find an old guy who can keep the seat warm for 5 years or so, and then we'll do the generational transition after that. So in 3 ballots, a very quick conclave, they elect Cardinal Gioacchino Vincenzo Luigi Raffaele Pecci, who was considered an old guy. He was 68, which is exactly what I am today. And proving once again that you never know what's going to come out of a conclave, he proceeds to have the second longest pontificate in reliably recorded history. He goes for 25 years, to 1903. Towards the end of that period, he's approached by a pious nun. Pope is now 91 years old, if I remember this correctly. And this pious nun says to him, "Your Holiness, I am praying that God will allow you to live to see your centenary." The The Pope responds, "My daughter, why put limits on the bounty of divine providence?" At the very beginning of his pontificate, Leo XIII, who had spent 20-some years in a kind of ecclesiastical exile as Bishop of Perugia, where he had thought through for 20 years the many facets of the problem of Catholicism in the modern world. At the very beginning of his pontificate, he takes a bold, grand, strategic decision. Rather than the strategy of his two immediate predecessors, Gregory XVI and Pius IX, toward the modern world, which was sort of a preview of Nancy Reagan's anti-drug campaign, just say no. That was the Catholic approach to modernity. Leo XIII takes the grand strategic decision that the Church will engage the modern world with distinctively Catholic tools in order to convert the modern world. And you can see this grand strategy of Leo XIII embodied in his tomb in Rome. Many of you have seen it. I'm sure it's to the left of the high altar as you face the high altar in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Pope's cathedral church in Rome. And unlike the usual papal funerary monument where the guy is laying on his back with his hands piously folded or he's kneeling, Leo XIII is standing up. And he's got the papal tiara on, and he's in a papal vestment, and he's got his right hand raised and his right foot thrust forward, as if he's saying to the modern world, we have something to talk about. We have a proposal to make. That grand strategic decision to engage modernity with distinctively Catholic tools sets in motion what I call in the book the Leonine Revolution. Its principal points, excuse me, include a rediscovery of St. Thomas Aquinas in the original text, not filtered through centuries of commentators, as a specifically Catholic way to engage modern intellectual life. It involves Leo's attempt to find a rapprochement with the rise of science. He opens the Vatican Observatory. Leo XIII opens the secret archives of the Vatican to qualified historians of all faiths or no faith, and initiates thereby the modern study of the Church's own history, which, as he must have known, would reveal that the Church, in fact, evolves and develops over time. From an American point of view, Leo XIII is particularly memorable for launching the social doctrine of the Church, a particularly distinctive way of thinking about modern public life with the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum. And 4 years after that, in an encyclical addressed to the bishops of the United States, Leo opens the door, if gingerly, to a Catholic rapprochement with the constitutional separation of church and state and the notion of religious freedom as a fundamental human right, both of which would then be validated by the Second Vatican Council. The Leonine Revolution, which is barely, if ever, discussed today, in part because there's no good contemporary biography of Leo XIII. That Leonine Revolution rippled through the Church, particularly in Europe, for the next 80 years. It caused a lot of air turbulence. One of the things I hope this book demonstrates, particularly to those who imagine that all was calm and bright before the Second Vatican Council, and why do we have to go through all that, is that things were not all calm and bright for the first 6 decades of the 20th century. There was an awful lot of air turbulence. We didn't particularly experience it here, except on the church-state question and some questions of biblical interpretation, because we were too busy building places like this. and churches and schools and all the rest of it. But in European Catholicism, which had went until well into the mid-20th century, was the demographic center of the world church. There was a lot of stuff going on, which I describe in the book. And virtually all of that, with probably the sole exception of the original liturgical movement, all of that is a product of that Leonine Revolution and that grand strategic decision at the beginning of the pontificate. The third pivotal point then comes in between 1959 and 1962. In 1958, 80 years after the election of Leo XIII, had another long pontificate, Pius XII, 19 years. We don't want to do that again. And by the way, the guy we want to elect Pope is sitting up in Milan without a red hat, Giovanni Battista Montini, who will eventually become Paul VI. So let's find an old guy. And they did. 78-year-old, 77-year-old Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, the Patriarch of Venice. And he does have a short pontificate, 4.5 years, but at the very beginning of it, in January 1959, he stuns the church and the world by announcing at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls that he is going to summon the 21st Ecumenical Council in the history of the church in order to gather up all of that energy that had been let loose through the Leonine Revolution, focus it through the prism of an ecumenical council, give the church a new Pentecostal experience, out of which would come a new commitment to the conversion of the modern world. And the real third pivotal point then comes on October 11th, 1962, when John XXIII opens the Second Vatican Council with a remarkable address known by its first three Latin words as Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, Mother Church rejoices. And I argue in this book that Gaudet Mater Ecclesia is the first announcement of what we now know as the new evangelization. Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, insofar as anybody remembers it today, is remembered for John XXIII's deprecation of what he called the prophets of gloom who see only bad stuff in the modern world. But there's an awful lot more in this 20-page text than ecclesiastical smackdown of grumpy guys. There is a vision of a church re-energized for mission, a church which needs to discover new ways to propose the gospel under the conditions of modernity, but a church that is fundamentally about the proclamation of the gospel for the conversion of the world. So then comes the council and 20 years of chaos and confusion, which begins to be resolved at the fourth pivotal point in this story, and that comes in 1975. Paul VI, elected in 1963, brings Vatican II to what I regard as a successful conclusion, and I discuss the four great documents of the Council, its four constitutions, in light of this Johannine vision of an evangelical Catholic future. Paul VI holds it together under some very difficult circumstances, but then things begin to get seriously wiggy. The reception of the council was very difficult. This is 1968 we're heading into. Then there's the Humanae Vitae controversy, et cetera. Things are getting a bit unglued. And then in 1975, Paul VI issues the first post-synodal apostolic exhortation. The Synod of 1974 had not been able to agree on a final report. So they gave all of the material of the Synod to the Pope and said, you do something about this. Paul VI then produces a post-synodal apostolic exhortation called Evangelii Nunciandi, announcing the gospel, proclaiming the gospel. And that is a real turning point in the self-understanding of the post-conciliar church back to the evangelical, mission-driven vision of John the 23rd in Gaudet Mater Ecclesia. And the man who drafted that letter, that exhortation for Paul VI, the Brazilian Dominican Lucas Moreira Neves, told me and wrote about this on its 20th anniversary. This was Paul VI's pastoral testimony, pastoral testament to the church. It's an attempt to reach back to that originating John the 23rd vision and say, all right, we need to get focused on this again. The fifth pivot comes in 1978, precisely 100 years after the election of Leo XIII. The unimaginable happens. A 58-year-old Polish bishop named Karol Wojtyła is elected pope, and working in a really quite remarkable and, if you will, ironic dyad with a German theologian named Joseph Ratzinger, Poles and Germans not having had a good 20th century together previously. They give Vatican II over 35 years, the last 8 of which Ratzinger is himself pope, an authoritative interpretation. And the pivot within that pivot comes in 1985. It's the 20th anniversary of the conclusion of the Council. John Paul II summons a special meeting of the Synod of Bishops to look at what has gone right and what has gone wrong in the implementation of Vatican II. And after 3 weeks of discussion, the fathers of that synod come up with something that had been missing. The Second Vatican Council was the first council in history that did not provide the keys to its own proper interpretation. Other councils had done this through a variety of means. You want to know what the Council of Nicaea was about? You read the Creed we recite on Sunday. If you want to know what the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon were about, you read their doctrinal definitions. Mary is Theotokos, Mother of God, two natures and one divine person of Christ. If you want to know what the Council of Trent was about, you can read either its condemnation of heresies or its catechism, which it commissioned, largely written and edited by St. Charles Borromeo. There was none of that at Vatican II. No creed, no condemnations, no doctrinal definitions, no canons written into the law of the church, which other councils have done. None of that, no catechism, none of that stuff. 16 documents of varying magisterial weight, but no thread to tie them together so that we can imagine those 16 documents as 16 pieces of cloth. What's the thread that weaves them into a coherent and beautiful tapestry? And the Synod of 1985 says the thread is the idea embedded in many of the council documents, but explicitly in the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, the most important of those documents. The Church is a communion of disciples in mission. That's what ties the whole thing together. Disciples, because Catholicism begins with friendship with the Lord Jesus Christ. Communion, because that friendship immediately incorporates you into the body of the other friends of the Lord Jesus, which is best described as a communion. But the communion doesn't exist for itself. The communion exists to offer to others, if you will, to give away the gift it has been given of that friendship with the Lord and incorporation into the communion of his friends. So a communion of disciples in mission. And then the sixth pivot, and the final one, you'll get the quiz on the way out the door. That was supposed to be a joke. You can all laugh. Thank you. Comes on January 6, 2000, when after the great Jubilee of 2000, to conclude that Jubilee year, John Paul II issues the apostolic letter Novo Millennio in Eunte, entering the new millennium, in which, in a sense, he sums up this entire development from Leo XIII to the Great Jubilee of 2000 by challenging the church, in the words of Luke chapter 5, verse 5, put out into the deep. The Latin phrase for that, duc in altum, from the Vulgate Bible, reverberates throughout Novo Millennio in Eunte as a kind of antiphon. And that was John Paul II's image for the church in the 21st century and the third millennium. You remember that biblical scene? Peter and Andrew are out on the Sea of Galilee. They haven't caught anything. They're coming back in. Jesus walks into the scene. He says, "What have you caught?" They say, "We've caught nothing." He says, "Put out into the deep for a catch." And they go out, and there's so many fish that they got to get James and John, their partners, to go out and help them haul it in. At which point they all become disciples and follow the Lord. That was John Paul II's biblical metaphor for the church in the 21st century and the third millennium. Leave the shallow, brackish, sometimes stale waters of institutional maintenance and put out into the deep of this roiling, troubled, storm-tossed, late modern and postmodern world for a catch of souls. Turn the institutions into platforms for mission. Institutions are important. You got to have institutions. This is the world. But the institutions don't exist for their own sake. They exist as platforms for the conversion of the world. Now, that way of looking at the history of the church over the past 200 years, I hope does some myth busting. The first of these historical myths that is the myth that one often finds in certain traditionalist Catholic circles today, that the preconciliar church was a stable institution with no real issues of self-understanding or purpose that had to be addressed. Therefore, Vatican II was a serious mistake. In fact, as I said a moment ago, the period 1878 to 1962, when the council begins, was a time of considerable ferment in the church, thanks to that Leonine revolution. And while it is true that the council caused a lot of turbulence, predicted by the man who saw it to a successful conclusion, Montini, who had been named John the 23rd's first cardinal, but had no idea that the Pope was about to do this council business. And the January 1959 night that John the 23rd blows everybody's mind by announcing an ecumenical council, Montini calls an old friend of his and says, "This holy old boy doesn't know what a hornet's nest he's stirring up." Well, he was right, but you don't have a hornet's nest unless you have hornets, right? So, they were already there. There was already a lot of stuff happening, and I argue in the book that the Second Vatican Council was essential to focusing those energies for the sake of the renewal of the Church's evangelical purpose. All of which is to say that change in the Catholic Church does not begin in 1962. It begins in 1878. And if we understand that and begin to see how that change evolved, we might get a better grip on our situation today. The second myth I hope is exploded by this book is that the Second Vatican Council was principally intended to reconfigure Catholicism interiorly. This was about a rearrangement of power within the Church. Now, Vatican II certainly enriched the Church's self-understanding. Prior to the Council, the classic post-Reformation, counter-Reformation description of the Church was a legal or juridical one. The Church was the societas perfecta. It was the perfect society, over against the world, hierarchically ordered, the U.S. Marine Corps in Catholic vestments. That's not the image of the Church that comes to the Second Vatican Council. If you read Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution of the Church, the Council Fathers spend almost 10 pages on rich biblical images of the Church. So there is certainly an enriched self-understanding coming out of Vatican II beyond this rather sterile notion of the perfect society. But if you read that enriched self-understanding through the prism of Gaudet Mater Ecclesiae, John the 23rd's evangelical intention for the Council, the 1985 Synod, and John Paul II's Novo Millennio in Eunte, the Council comes into clearer focus as the point at which the Leonine Revolution engaged modernity in order to convert the modernity and put the modern world's aspirations to freedom and solidarity on a firmer philosophical and indeed theological foundation. That Leonine Revolution comes to its first maturity in what we now call the New Evangelization, which, by the way, includes the social witness and social doctrine of the Church. You can't separate these two things. The proclamation of the gospel and the the proposing of a more coherent and nobler view of the modern quest for freedom, justice, solidarity, peace, etc., go together. The third myth that I hope is exploded by the book is that the past 50 years of contention over the proper understanding of Vatican II is really a contest between so-called progressives and so-called traditionalists. The fact is that there has been what I call in the book a war of the conciliar succession. Who gets to own Vatican II? That's true, but it began at the Council. It began in the Council's third period when the reformist bishops and theologians split into two camps. They're conventionally identified with the journals Concilium and Communio, but this was a split within the reformists. I mean, they had won the day. This was going to be a council of development of doctrine. But then you get a split between those who want that development deeply rooted in the tradition of the Church and those who believe that the modern intellectual project and contemporary culture trumped that authoritative tradition. And this war of the conciliar succession is going on today. It went on at the synods of 2014 and 2015, represented on the one side perhaps by Cardinal Carlo Caffarra and on the other by Cardinal Walter Casper. And there are some very serious issues that continue to be debated today beneath the surface of of what appear to be the contested points. The synods of 2014 and 2015 seem to be primarily about sacramental discipline and the admission of those whose marriages had not been blessed by the church to Holy Communion. In fact, playing out this war of the conciliar succession, what was really going on underneath that argument was the question, is revelation binding over time, so that when the Lord says what marriage is and St. Paul says what worthiness to receive Holy Communion is, that binds us as well as 2,000 years ago? Or, as the Casper camp was proposing, no, we actually know more, and therefore our historical experience has to judge and tweak, if you will, revelation. That's to reduce things to a terribly simple level, but I think it's not an accurate description of what was going on. And this is really a battle over the meaning of the council. The second most important constitution of Vatican II is the Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, known by its Latin name, Dei Verbum. Dei Verbum, paragraphs 7 and 8, makes absolutely clear that the council teaches divine revelation is real. This is not a story. This is not mythology. There are truths conveyed in divine revelation that are binding, period, irrespective of historical circumstance. That's what's being contested throughout some parts of the world church today. Is that true? And then, moving on to certain controversies of today, John Paul II's 1993 encyclical on the reform of Catholic moral theology, Veritatis Splendor, taught unambiguously that there are certain actions that are never morally justifiable. We call these things that are malum in se, evil in themselves. Some people use the term intrinsic evil. That is denied by any number of prominent Catholic moral theologians. That's an important fight to have. Because if there aren't intrinsically evil acts, of which we can all imagine some without too much difficulty, then where precisely are the boundaries? And do we find ourselves in the condition of liberal Protestant communities which really can't tell you where the boundaries are and therefore cease to be of interest? Then there was the claim of the instruction from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith during the Great Jubilee. Dominus Jesus, Jesus Christ is the unique Savior of the world, such that everyone who is saved through him in some fashion. This is a kind of classic Catholic position, and yet one of the things that is going to be argued in Rome at this Amazonian Synod is precisely that point. Is that true or not? Why is any of this of consequence? It's of consequence, I think, because we can't see the present clearly. Seeing the present clearly is hard enough to do on its own. We can't see the present clearly unless we see the past clearly and know how we came to where we are. Second, it's important because we can learn the essential meaning of today's contestations by better understanding the nature of the arguments over the past 200 years. Because a great deal of what we're arguing about today, including the points I just mentioned, has been contested in world Christianity for a considerable length of time, several centuries. And the third reason this revisionist view of history is of some consequence, I think, is because it puts today's crisis of clerical sexual abuse and malfeasant church leadership into clearer focus, which I have to say with some regret I did not hear here 48 hours ago. What this is really about, what is this moment? It is a moment of essential purification, which is going to be painful purification, so that the church can realize the truth about its fundamental evangelical vocation. We cannot proclaim the truths that the church bears as a gift from the Lord if we're not living those truths. We're never going to live them perfectly, but there's a difference between imperfection and grave sin, criminal activity, malfeasant leadership, etc. This is an essential moment of purification in order to realize the new evangelization. And if we think of that in those terms, it's not going to make us feel any better about all the bad stuff that's going on, but it may help us see that in these multiple providential ironies of history, we can come through this and out the far side with a purer, more evangelically compelling, more mission-driven church. So that's what the book is all about. It doesn't have a single piece of academic apparatus in it. It's very user-friendly, reader-friendly. I invite you to have a look, but I think we have some time now for questions. Thank you all very much. Professor Sneed seems to have the great pox of Mesopotamia. I just have a bad head cold. Who wants? I can't. It's hard to see people with these lights. So, yes, ma'am. Please tell us who you are, since I don't know everybody. Yeah.
My name is Catherine Viz, and thank you very much, of course, for speaking today and your new book. So I guess my one question for you to ponder and reflect on, if you have any thoughts, is what do you think of the irony of especially Catholic institutions, so we're looking at Catholic universities, especially in America, not truly living up to their Catholic doctrine, like not in any way reinforcing Catholic beliefs, whether we see it here at Notre Dame, we see it in Georgetown, we see it in a lot of different universities that claim to be Catholic across the U.S., and yet are benefiting from these secular draws, whether it be through donors or through people through administration. So what are your thoughts on that, of how to remain resoundingly Catholic in difficult times?
Well, I think I mean, look, this has been a problem for quite a while now, as we know, and whatever the challenges here, they are by no means as great as the challenges in other places, one of which you mentioned, which I believe is just a lost cause. There's no way Georgetown is going to become a recognizably Catholic institution in terms of curriculum, faculty, mode of life on campus, or self-concept in the foreseeable future. They've gone down a different path. I believe the phrase is they have different aspirational peers. This is different here. There's an ongoing, and I think very often fruitful discussion here about what does it mean to be a Catholic institution of higher education. Doesn't mean to be a catechism class, period. One of the things that's so important about the Ukrainian Catholic University and work of Professor Torkanovsky and his friends is that they're dealing with a culture that's even more wounded than ours. And the university has been deliberately designed in a variety of ways, including having large communities on campus and as well as its intellectual life, to address the fragmentation of a society that, frankly, communism tried to destroy. I think the answer to how to intensify Catholic identity is you have to believe that the university, while it has many missions, does have an evangelical mission. That to be a Catholic university means to be a university in mission. And that mission can mean many things. It can mean all the good work that people do in the third world or in inner cities and crisis pregnancy centers. That's all important. But it also has to mean the deeper conversion of students, and it has to mean preparing them to be missionary disciples. Pope Francis says everybody in the church is a missionary. He wants a church of missionary disciples. And everywhere is mission territory. That was the message of John Paul II in Redemptoris Missio in 1990. If you're thinking that way, then you're going to order the life of the university in that way. And that, it's not just liberal arts, what my friend Professor Streich is doing with the recreation of beauty as an architectural form in the life of the church is part of the new evangelization. It's an expensive part of the new evangelization, but it's a part of it. I said to the Legatus group here in South Bend, when was that, Duncan, last spring or something? I said, I think his chapel at St. Thomas Aquinas, at Thomas Aquinas College in California is the most important Catholic building in the United States in the last 50 years. Because it responds to the peculiar challenge of evangelization in a culture that has an insecure grasp on both truth and goodness. If it's just your truth and my truth and nothing called the truth, we don't have a real grasp on truth. If good is what I will, Frank Sinatra's moral philosophy, I did it my way, we don't have a pretty good grasp on goodness. Beauty can be an avenue back to a firmer grasp on truth and goodness. So there's a lot of ways a university can advance that evangelical mission, but you got to want to do it first, and you got to see yourself in those terms first. Yeah.
So we had the great privilege to have breakfast with you this morning, and my 15-year-old was in attendance.
The cheesy eggs were very good.
I have to say, I'm very impressed with the upcoming generation. And I was watching an ESPN special where Nick Saban said that he can't coach the same way he did 20 years ago because if the players don't understand why, you can't just tell them to do something, right? It's no longer block and they block. They want to know why or how it fits. My daughter took issue with the fact that you said this morning some things you have to come to with a closed mind and a closed mouth.
No, that's not what I said, but anyway.
And in fact, I tried to give her the context that, really what you were saying is if you don't stand for something, you fall for anything, right? You have to have some grounding in your own confidence of what's right and what's wrong. You got to open that up. But I also substitute teach once in a while for CCD, and I got hit with a question last week. Why is it superior to be a Catholic? Why is it good? Why am I here? Why is this the best way to go? Type of thing. And I thought that that's perfect what my daughter thinks about, perfect with what Nick Saban was saying. And I'd like to ask you, how can the church do better in instilling that pride and that knowledge of why Catholicism?
Okay, did everybody hear that or no? Everybody heard it over there? Okay, so I think we're okay. First of all, what I said with this group this morning, we were talking about, what explains the nones, N-O-N-E-S. Post-millennial young people who are just not in the religion game at all and have no interest in being. And I was suggesting it had something to do with the dominance of science as the paradigm of all what's really knowledge. And then one of the students said, no, I think it really has to do with the insistence by many young people to keep an open mind and the Catholic Church seems like it's closed. And what would I say to that? And I said, well, what I would say, first of all, is what G.K. Chesterton said: an open mind, like an open mouth, should close on something. I mean, that's a good little Chestertonian aphorism. I mean, my selfish answer to your question is every CCD class, high school seniors in the country should buy Letters to a Young Catholic, and then all of this will become luminously clear. I believe that the Catholic Church is the fullest expression of what Christ intended for the body of his followers. There are many different expressions of that. I believe the Catholic expression is the fullest expression of that. And if you want to see that in a visual way, with sufficient content to bring it home, it's not my book. It's something, Letters to a Young Catholic, it's something my book helped kick an idea off in the mind of now Bishop Robert Barron. His Catholicism series is the most effective visual presentation of Catholic faith since they built the windows at Chartres Cathedral. I mean, and for this era of visual learning, it's absolutely colossal. And I would offer that to young people. I think if you just watch the first episode, 50 minutes, it's so visually compelling that you're drawn into the exploration of what does all this stuff mean. And as you go through that series, as I hope you go through Letters to a Young Catholic, you want to know more, because it suddenly appears this is not some closed quadratic equation. This is really a calculus. It's got all sorts of moving parts in it. It's got lots of interesting stuff, intellectually, aesthetically, etc. And you want to immerse yourself in it more. And I guess the other thing I would say is that 2,000 years of human experience have demonstrated that this is a path to happiness, to living with an undivided heart. It's not a perfect path in the lives of any of its people, but it is a path. And I would always insist to young people that the Church's moral teaching is about happiness. It's about beatitude. The center of Catholic moral theology is not the Ten Commandments. It's the Beatitudes. That's what we begin with, because that's where we want to be. And the rules are like guardrails guiding us towards that beatitude. That has been one of the great recoveries of Catholic moral theology over the past 50 years. Technically, we call it virtue ethics. It's a very important rediscovery. It's a classic Thomistic approach, Aquinas approach to these things. But to realize that every time the Church says no to something, it's because of a higher and more compelling yes. The no's only make sense in terms of the yes. So you got to begin in explaining this stuff with the yes rather than the no. So those are some thoughts on that. Yes?
I'm Isaac Kimmel. I'm a doctoral student in sociology. I know it's obnoxious to ask for prognostications on the future, but what's the next pivot point in church history? Where do you see the hornets now? What issue will bring that about?
Well, I discussed this a bit at the end of the book. When last summer, when I was, excuse me, I thought this was finished, and then we get Crisis 2.0. Thank you. So I have to rewrite the last 30 pages of the book. And I said there that it may be that a combination, this isn't the U.S. circumstance, let's just leave it at that, that a combination of our own stupidity, political aggression, an aggressive tort bar, will play the role in the Catholic Church that Nebuchadnezzar played in the Old Testament. He tore down the temple. We may look very institutionally different 50 years from now than we did then. But even if we did, what we've learned over these past 200 years, this is a church of evangelical mission, and it has a social doctrine that is essential to save postmodernity from its own craziness. Those will remain the case. It's going to be more difficult to effect that evangelization and that reform of postmodernity, but that'll still be the case. So in a sense, we're through the pivot. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that the next conclave is going to be a pivot point. We have taken a different direction over the past 6.5 years, which I try to describe with some calm, unlike others, in the penultimate section of the book. So there is going to be a genuine contestation between the view of Vatican II coming out of John Paul II and Benedict XVI and the view that has prevailed, at least in some quarters, over the past 6.5 years. I think it is instructive going forward that the living parts of the world church, whether we're talking about parishes, dioceses, religious communities, countries, seminaries, you go through the colleges and universities, you go through the list, that have adopted this evangelical view of the Catholic future and are living that through what I have described elsewhere as all-in Catholicism. We're attempting to live it through that. Those are living. And despite the cultural tsunami that's washing over us, they're not only living, some of them are thriving. And the places where the church is dying throughout the world are the places that are still trying to make Catholic light work. Catholic light never works. Look at Germany today, and you will see the effects of Catholic light. 2% mass attendance on Sunday. It's not the only measure of Catholic vitality, but that's telling you something. Catholic light does not work. And if you believe that by work we mean sharing this gospel, which is the truth of the world, we think, then you ought to look very seriously at that. So that's another way to define the future pivot.
Let's get one more question at least. Let's get you both. Why don't you both ask your questions and then George can answer.
I can't even see him. Who's asking a question here? Holly.
My name is Chloe McGrath. I'm
I
a
know
senior
that.
at Notre Dame.
I've been feeding you for the past 2 days here.
Thank you for answering another one of my questions. I'm wondering, what does political activity look like in relation to this evangelical mission of the Catholic Church? Do we work to transform culture and society in hopes that one day our politics will reflect this transformation, or are we bound to pursue more directly?
I think we have to do both.
Okay.
I mean, I am not a Rod Dreher fan. I am not a Ben Opp person. First of all, I don't think anybody really knows what this means. Secondly, if you really are talking about withdrawing from political life in order to form intentional communities that are somehow going to revitalize the culture and then we can get back to politics, first of all, they're not going to let you do it. We should have learned this lesson in the past. We are not going to be let alone. They're just not going to do it. Secondly, I think it's an abrogation of responsibility. There are good people in politics. They deserve more than the support of our prayers. They certainly deserve that, but they deserve more support as well. It's getting crazier and crazier in politics and will continue to do so until more sane people get in. So I think it's both. Yes, Noel.
I was wondering where Pius XII fits into your narrative. I think you
Yeah.
could read it as maybe a disruption in this mission of evangelical activity, but you could also see him as a continuation of what Leo XIII
Yeah,
did.
I position him, I divide the pontificate into two phases, the first half and the second half. I think the first half is a cautious but real extension of the Leonine Revolution, and then the brakes get put on in 1950 with the encyclical Humane Generis, and then he's basically sick for the last 5 years of the pontificate, and things get a bit stale. But the evidence for this, that he's in that Leonine trajectory, is the documents of Vatican II. The single most cited source in the footnotes of the documents of Vatican II is the Bible. The second most cited source is the Magisterium of Pope Pius XII. So he, in a sense, cues this up in a way that probably he couldn't have imagined, but that's another irony in the fire. Good. Thank you all very much. I look forward to meeting you and signing some books. Thank you.